1910 Subpart T, Commercial Diving Operations. 1910.401, Scope and Application. 1910.401, A, Scope. 1910.401, A1, this subpart, standard, applies to every place of employment within the waters of the United States, or within any state, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, Wake Island, Johnston Island, the Canal Zone, or within the Outer Continental Shelf Lands as defined in the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, 67 Stat. 462, 43 U.S.C. 1331, where diving and related support operations are performed. 1910.401, A2, this standard applies to diving and related support operations conducted in connection with all types of work and employments, including general industry, construction, ship repairing, shipbuilding, shipbreaking, and longshoring. However, this standard does not apply to any diving operation. 1910.401, A2, I, through 1910.401, A2, 3, performed solely for instructional purposes, using open circuit, compressed air SCUBA, and conducted within the no decompression limits. Performed solely for search, rescue, or related public safety purposes by or under the control of a governmental agency, or governed by 45 CFR Part 46, Protection of Human Subjects, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or equivalent rules or regulations established by another federal agency, which regulate research, development, or related purposes involving human subjects. 1910.401, A2, 4, defined as scientific diving and which is under the direction and control of a diving program containing at least the following elements. 1910.401, A2, 4, A, Diving Safety Manual, which includes at a minimum, procedures covering all diving operations specific to the program, procedures for emergency care, including recompression and evacuation, and criteria for diver training and certification. 1910.401, A2, 4, B, Diving Control, Safety, Board, with the majority of its members being active divers, which shall at a minimum have the authority to approve unmonitored diving projects, review and revise the Diving Safety Manual, assure compliance with the manual, certify the depths to which a diver has been trained, take disciplinary action for unsafe practices, and assure adherence to the buddy system. A diver is accompanied by and is in continuous contact with another diver in the water, for scuba diving. 1910.401, A3, Alternative Requirements for Recreational Diving Instructors and Diving Guides. Employers of recreational diving instructors and diving guides are not required to comply with the decompression chamber requirements specified by paragraphs B2 and C3 of Section 1910.423 and paragraph B1 of Section 1910.426 when they meet all of the following conditions. 1910.401 A3 I through 1910.401 A3 The instructor or guide is engaging solely in recreational diving instruction or dive guiding operations. The instructor or guide is diving within the no decompression limits in these operations. The instructor or guide is using a nitrox breathing gas mixture consisting of a high percentage of oxygen, more than 22% by volume, mixed with nitrogen. The instructor or guide is using an open circuit, semi-closed circuit, or closed circuit self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, SCUBA, and the employer of the instructor or guide is complying with all requirements of Appendix C of this subpart. 1910.401, B, Application in Emergencies. An employer may deviate from the requirements of this standard to the extent necessary to prevent or minimize a situation which is likely to cause death, serious physical harm, or major environmental damage, provided that the employer 1910.401, B1, notifies the Area Director, Occupational Safety and Health Administration within 48 hours of the onset of the emergency situation, indicating the nature of the emergency and extent of the deviation from the prescribed regulations, and 1910.401, B2, upon request from the Area Director, submits such information in writing. 1910.401, C, Employer Obligation. The employer shall be responsible for compliance with 1910.401, C1, all provisions of this standard of general applicability, and 1910.401, C2, all requirements pertaining to specific diving modes to the extent diving operations in such modes are conducted. 1910.402. Definitions. As used in this standard, the listed terms are defined as follows: ACM, actual cubic feet per minute. ASME code or equivalent. ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, Section 8, or an equivalent code which the employer can demonstrate to be equally effective. ATA, Atmosphere Absolute. Bell, an enclosed compartment, pressurized, closed bell, or unpressurized, open bell, which allows the diver to be transported to and from the underwater work area and which may be used as a temporary refuge during diving operations. Bottom time, the total elapsed time measured in minutes from the time when the diver leaves the surface in descent to the time that the diver begins ascent. Bursting pressure, the pressure at which a pressure containment device would fail structurally. Cylinder, a pressure vessel for the storage of gases. Decompression chamber, a pressure vessel for human occupancy such as a surface decompression chamber, closed bell, or deep diving system used to decompress divers and to treat decompression sickness. Decompression sickness, a condition with a variety of symptoms which may result from gas or bubbles in the tissues of divers after pressure reduction. Decompression table, a profile or set of profiles of depth-time relationships for ascent rates and breathing mixtures to be followed after a specific depth-time exposure or exposures. Dive guiding operations means leading groups of sports divers who use an open circuit, semi-closed circuit, or closed circuit self-contained underwater breathing apparatus to local undersea diving locations for recreational purposes. Dive location, a surface or vessel from which a diving operation is conducted. Dive location reserve breathing gas, a supply system of air or mixed gas, as appropriate, at the dive location which is independent of the primary supply system and sufficient to support divers during the planned decompression. Dive team, divers and support employees involved in a diving operation, including the designated person in charge. Diver, an employee working in water using underwater apparatus which supplies compressed breathing gas at the ambient pressure. Diver carried reserve breathing gas, a diver carried supply of air or mixed gas, as appropriate, sufficient under standard operating conditions to allow the diver to reach the surface, or another source of breathing gas, or to be reached by a standby diver. Diving mode, a type of diving requiring specific equipment, procedures and techniques, SCUBA, surface supplied air, or mixed gas. FSW, feet of seawater, or equivalent static pressure head. Heavy gear, diver worn deep sea dress including helmet, breastplate, dry suit, and weighted shoes. Hyperbaric conditions, pressure conditions in excess of surface pressure. In-water stage, a suspended underwater platform which supports a diver in the water. Liveboating, the practice of supporting a surface-supplied air or mixed gas diver from a vessel which is underway. Mixed gas diving, a diving mode in which the diver is supplied in the water with a breathing gas other than air. No decompression limits, the depth time limits of the no decompression limits and repetitive dive group designation table for no decompression air dives, US. Navy diving manual or equivalent limits which the employer can demonstrate to be equally effective. SI, G, pounds per square inch, gauge. Recreational diving instruction means training diving students in the use of recreational diving procedures and the safe operation of diving equipment, including an open circuit, semi-closed circuit, or closed circuit self-contained underwater breathing apparatus during dives. Scientific diving means diving performed solely as a necessary part of a scientific, research, or educational activity by employees whose sole purpose for diving is to perform scientific research tasks. Scientific diving does not include performing any tasks usually associated with commercial diving such as placing or removing heavy objects underwater, inspection of pipelines and similar objects, construction, demolition, cutting or welding, or the use of explosives. Scuba diving, a diving mode independent of surface supply in which the diver uses open-circuit self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Standby diver, a diver at the dive location available to assist a diver in the water. Surface-supplied air diving, a diving mode in which the diver in the water is supplied from the dive location with compressed air for breathing. Treatment table, a depth time and breathing gas profile designed to treat decompression sickness. Umbilical, the composite hose bundle between a dive location and a diver or bell, or between a diver and a bell, which supplies the diver or bell with breathing gas, communications, power, or heat as appropriate to the diving mode or conditions, and includes a safety line between the diver and the dive location. Volume tank. A pressure vessel connected to the outlet of a compressor and used as an air reservoir. Working pressure. The maximum pressure to which a pressure containment device may be exposed under standard operating conditions. 1910.410 Qualifications of Dive Team. 1910.410 A. General. 1910.410 A.1. Each dive team member shall have the experience or training necessary to perform assigned tasks in a safe and healthful manner. 1910.410 A.2. Each dive team member shall have experience or training in the following: 1910.410 A.2 I through 1910.410 A.2 3. The use of tools, equipment, and systems relevant to assigned tasks, techniques of the assigned diving mode, and diving operations and emergency procedures. 1910.410 A.3. All dive team members shall be trained in cardiopulmonary resuscitation and first aid, American Red Cross standard course or equivalent. 1910.410 A.4. Dive team members who are exposed to or control the exposure of others to hyperbaric conditions shall be trained in diving-related physics and physiology. 1910.410 B. Assignments. 1910.410 B.1. Each dive team member shall be assigned tasks in accordance with the employee's experience or training, except that limited additional tasks may be assigned to an employee undergoing training provided that these tasks are performed under the direct supervision of an experienced dive team member. 1910.410 B.2. The employer shall not require a dive team member to be exposed to hyperbaric conditions against the employee's will, except when necessary to complete decompression or treatment procedures. 1910.410 B.3. The employer shall not permit a dive team member to dive or be otherwise exposed to hyperbaric conditions for the duration of any temporary physical impairment or condition which is known to the employer and is likely to affect adversely the safety or health of a dive team member. 1910.410 C. Designated person in charge. 1910.410 C.1. The employer or an employee designated by the employer shall be at the dive location in charge of all aspects of the diving operation affecting the safety and health of dive team members. 1910.410 C.2. The designated person in charge shall have experience and training in the conduct of the assigned diving operation. 1910.420 Safe Practices Manual. 1910.420 A. General. The employer shall develop and maintain a safe practices manual which shall be made available at the dive location to each dive team member. 1910.420 B. Contents. 1910.420 B.1. The Safe Practices Manual shall contain a copy of this standard and the employer's policies for implementing the requirements of this standard. 1910.420 B.2. For each diving mode engaged in, the Safe Practices Manual shall include 1910.420 B.2 I through 1910.420 B.2 4 Safety procedures and checklists for diving operations, assignments and responsibilities of the dive team members, equipment procedures and checklists, and emergency procedures for fire, equipment failure, adverse environmental conditions, and medical illness and injury. 1910.421 Pre-dive procedures. 1910.421 A. General. The employer shall comply with the following requirements prior to each diving operation, unless otherwise specified. 1910.421 B. Emergency aid. A list shall be kept at the dive location of the telephone or call numbers of the following: 1910.421 B.1 through 1910.421 B.5, an operational decompression chamber, if not at the dive location, accessible hospitals, available physicians, available means of transportation, and the nearest U.S. Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center. 1910.421 C. First aid supplies. 1910.421 C.1. A first aid kit appropriate for the diving operation and approved by a physician shall be available at the dive location. 1910.421(c)(2). When used in a decompression chamber or bell, the first aid kit shall be suitable for use under hyperbaric conditions. 1910.421(c)(3). In addition to any other first aid supplies, an American Red Cross Standard First Aid Handbook or equivalent, and a bag-type manual resuscitator with transparent mask and tubing shall be available at the dive location. 1910.421(d). Planning and assessment. Planning of a diving operation shall include an assessment of the safety and health aspects of the following. 1910.421(d)(1) through 1910.421(d)(9). Diving mode, surface and underwater conditions and hazards, breathing gas supply, including reserves, thermal protection, diving equipment and systems, dive team assignments and physical fitness of dive team members, including any impairment known to the employer, repetitive dive designation or residual inert gas status of dive team members, decompression and treatment procedures, including altitude corrections, and emergency procedures. 1910.421(e). Hazardous activities. To minimize hazards to the dive team, diving operations shall be coordinated with other activities in the vicinity which are likely to interfere with the diving operation. 1910.421(f). Employee briefing. 1910.421(f)(1). Dive team members shall be briefed on 1910.421(f)(1)(i) through 1910.421(f)(1)(4). The tasks to be undertaken, safety procedures for the diving mode, any unusual hazards or environmental conditions likely to affect the safety of the diving operation, and any modifications to operating procedures necessitated by the specific diving operation. 1910.421(f)(2). Prior to making individual dive team member assignments, the employer shall inquire into the dive team member's current state of physical fitness and indicate to the dive team member the procedure for reporting physical problems or adverse physiological effects during and after the dive. 1910.421(g). Equipment inspection. The breathing gas supply system, including reserve breathing gas supplies, masks, helmets, thermal protection, and bell handling mechanism, when appropriate, shall be inspected prior to each dive. 1910.421(h). Warning signal. When diving from surfaces other than vessels in areas capable of supporting marine traffic, a rigid replica of the International Code Flag A at least 1 meter in height shall be displayed at the dive location in a manner which allows all-round visibility, and shall be illuminated during night diving operations. 1910.422. Procedures during dive. 1910.422(a). General. The employer shall comply with the following requirements which are applicable to each diving operation unless otherwise specified. 1910.422(b). Water entry and exit. 1910.422(b)(1). A means capable of supporting the diver shall be provided for entering and exiting the water. 1910.422(b)(2). The means provided for exiting the water shall extend below the water surface. 1910.422(b)(3). A means shall be provided to assist an injured diver from the water or into a bell. 1910.422(c). Communications. 1910.422(c)(1). An operational two-way voice communication system shall be used between 1910.422(c)(1)(i) through 1910.422(c)(1)(2). Each surface-applied air or mixed gas diver and a dive team member at the dive location or bell, when provided or required, and the bell and the dive location. 1910.422(c)(2). An operational, two-way communication system shall be available at the dive location to obtain emergency assistance. 1910.422(d). Decompression tables. Decompression, repetitive, and no decompression tables, as appropriate, shall be at the dive location. 1910.422(e). Dive profiles. A depth time profile, including when appropriate any breathing gas changes, shall be maintained for each diver during the dive, including decompression. 1910.422(f). Handheld power tools and equipment. 1910.422(f). F1. Handheld electrical tools and equipment shall be de-energized before being placed into or retrieved from the water. 1910.422 F2. Handheld power tools shall not be supplied with power from the dive location until requested by the diver. 1910.422 G. Welding and burning. 1910.422 G1. A current supply switch to interrupt the current flow to the welding or burning electrode shall be. 1910.422 G1 I through 1910.422 G1 2. Tended by a dive team member in voice communication with the diver performing the welding or burning, and kept in the open position except when the diver is welding or burning. 1910.422 G2. The welding machine frame shall be grounded. 1910.422 G3. Welding and burning cables, electrode holders, and connections shall be capable of carrying the maximum current required by the work, and shall be properly insulated. 1910.422 G4. Insulated gloves shall be provided to divers performing welding and burning operations. 1910.422 G5. Prior to welding or burning on closed compartments, structures, or pipes, which contain a flammable vapor or in which a flammable vapor may be generated by the work, they shall be vented, flooded, or purged with a mixture of gases which will not support combustion. 1910.422 H. Explosives. 1910.422 H1. Employers shall transport, store, and use explosives in accordance with this section and the applicable provisions of sections 1910.109 and 1926.912 of Title 29 of the Code of Federal Regulations. 1910.422 H2. Electrical continuity of explosive circuits shall not be tested until the diver is out of the water. 1910.422 H3. Explosives shall not be detonated while the diver is in the water. 1910.422 I. Termination of dive. The working interval of a dive shall be terminated when 1910.422 I1. A diver requests termination. 1910.422 I2. A diver fails to respond correctly to communications or signals from a dive team member. 1910.422 I3. Communications are lost and cannot be quickly re-established between the diver and a dive team member at the dive location, and between the designated person in charge and the person controlling the vessel in live boating operations, or 1910.422 I4. A diver begins to use diver-carried reserve breathing gas or the dive location reserve breathing gas. 1910.423 Post-dive procedures. 1910.423 A. General. The employer shall comply with the following requirements which are applicable after each diving operation, unless otherwise specified. 1910.423 B. Precautions. 1910.423 B1. After the completion of any dive, the employer shall 1910.423 B1 I through 1910.423 B1 4. Check the physical condition of the diver. Instruct the diver to report any physical problems or adverse physiological effects, including symptoms of decompression sickness. Advise the diver of the location of a decompression chamber which is ready for use, and alert the diver to the potential hazards of flying after diving. 1910.423 B2. For any dive outside the no decompression limits, deeper than 100 FSW or using mixed gas as a breathing mixture, the employer shall instruct the diver to remain awake and in the vicinity of the decompression chamber which is at the dive location for at least 1 hour after the dive, including decompression or treatment as appropriate. 1910.423 C. Recompression capability. 1910.423 C1. A decompression chamber capable of recompressing the diver at the surface to a minimum of 165 FSW, 6 ATA, shall be available at the dive location for 1910.423 C1 I through 1910.423 C1 3. Surface supplied air diving to depths deeper than 100 FSW and shallower than 220 FSW. Mixed gas diving shallower than 300 FSW, or diving outside the no decompression limits shallower than 300 FSW. 1910.423 C2. A decompression chamber capable of recompressing the diver at the surface to the maximum depth of the dive shall be available at the dive location for dives deeper than 300 FSW. 1910.423 C3. The decompression chamber shall be 1910.423 C3 I through 1910.423 C3 dual lock, multi-place, and located within 5 minutes of the dive location. 1910.423 C4. The decompression chamber shall be equipped with 1910.423 C4 I through 1910.423 C4 V. A pressure gauge for each pressurized compartment designed for human occupancy. A built-in breathing system with a minimum of 1 mask per occupant. A two-way voice communication system between occupants and a dive team member at the dive location. A viewport and illumination capability to light the interior. 1910.423 C5. Treatment tables, treatment gas appropriate to the diving mode, and sufficient gas to conduct treatment shall be available at the dive location. 1910.423 C6. A dive team member shall be available at the dive location during and for at least 1 hour after the dive to operate the decompression chamber, when required or provided. 1910.423 D. Record of dive. 1910.423 D1. The following information shall be recorded and maintained for each diving operation. 1910.423 D1 I through 1910.423 D1 6. Names of dive team members including designated person in charge, date, time, and location, diving modes used, general nature of work performed, approximate underwater and surface conditions, visibility, water temperature and current, and maximum depth and bottom time for each diver. 1910.423 D2. For each dive outside the no decompression limits, deeper than 100 FSW or using mixed gas, the following additional information shall be recorded and maintained. 1910.423 D2 I through 1910.423 D2 3. Depth time and breathing gas profiles, decompression table designation, including modification, and elapsed time since last pressure exposure if less than 24 hours or repetitive dive designation for each diver. 1910.423 D3. For each dive in which decompression sickness is suspected or symptoms are evident, the following additional information shall be recorded and maintained. 1910.423 D3 I. Description of decompression sickness symptoms, including depth and time of onset, and 1910.423 D3 2. Description and results of treatment. 1910.423 E. Decompression procedure assessment. The employer shall 1910.423 E1. Investigate and evaluate each incident of decompression sickness based on the recorded information, consideration of the past performance of decompression table used, and individual susceptibility. 1910.423 E2. Take appropriate corrective action to reduce the probability of recurrence of decompression sickness. And 1910.423 E3. Prepare a written evaluation of the decompression procedure assessment, including any corrective action taken, within 45 days of the incident of decompression sickness. 1910.424 Scuba diving. 1910.424 A. General. Employers engaged in scuba diving shall comply with the following requirements, unless otherwise specified. 1910.424 B. Limits. Scuba diving shall not be conducted. 1910.424 B1. At depths deeper than 130 FSW. 1910.424 B2. At depths deeper than 100 FSW or outside the no decompression limits unless a decompression chamber is ready for use. 1910.424 B3. Against currents exceeding 1 not unless line tended, or 1910.424 B4. In enclosed or physically confining spaces unless line tended. 1910.424 C. Procedures. 1910.424 C1. A standby diver shall be available while a diver is in the water. 1910.424 C2. A diver shall be line tended from the surface, or accompanied by another diver in the water in continuous visual contact during the diving operations. 1910.424 C3. A diver shall be stationed at the underwater point of entry when diving is conducted in enclosed or physically confining spaces. 1910.424 C4. A diver carried reserve breathing gas supply shall be provided for each diver consisting of 1910.424 C4 a manual reserve J valve, or 1910.424 C4 2 an independent reserve cylinder with a separate regulator or connected to the underwater breathing apparatus. 1910.424 C5 the valve of the reserve breathing gas supply shall be in the closed position prior to the dive. 1910.425 Surface supplied air diving. 1910.425 A. General. Employers engaged in surface supplied air diving shall comply with the following requirements, unless otherwise specified. 1910.425 B. Limits. 1910.425 B1 Surface supplied air diving shall not be conducted at depths deeper than 190 FSW, except that dives with bottom times of 30 minutes or less may be conducted to depths of 220 FSW. 1910.425 B2 A decompression chamber shall be ready for use at the dive location for any dive outside the no decompression limits or deeper than 100 FSW. 1910.425 B3 A bell shall be used for dives with an in-water decompression time greater than 120 minutes, except when heavy gear is worn or diving is conducted in physically confining spaces. 1910.425 C. Procedures. 1910.425 C1 Each diver shall be continuously tended while in the water. 1910.425 C2 A diver shall be stationed at the underwater point of entry when diving is conducted in enclosed or physically confining spaces. 1910.425 C3 Each diving operation shall have a primary breathing gas supply sufficient to support divers for the duration of the planned dive, including decompression. 1910.425 C4 For dives deeper than 100 FSW or outside the no decompression limits. 1910.425 C4 I through 1910.425 C4 A separate dive team member shall tend each diver in the water. A standby diver shall be available while a diver is in the water. A diver carried reserve breathing gas supply shall be provided for each diver except when heavy gear is worn, and a dive location reserve breathing gas supply shall be provided. 1910.425 C5 For heavy gear diving deeper than 100 FSW or outside the no decompression limits. 1910.425 C5 I An extra breathing gas hose capable of supplying breathing gas to the diver in the water shall be available to the standby diver. 1910.425 C5 2 An in-water stage shall be provided to divers in the water. 1910.425 C6 Except when heavy gear is worn or where physical space does not permit, a diver carried reserve breathing gas supply shall be provided whenever the diver is prevented by the configuration of the dive area from ascending directly to the surface. 1910.426 Mixed gas diving. 1910.426 A. General. Employers engaged in mixed gas diving shall comply with the following requirements, unless otherwise specified. 1910.426 B. Limits. Mixed gas diving shall be conducted only when 1910.426 B1 A decompression chamber is ready for use at the dive location, and 1910.426 B1 I A bell is used at depths greater than 220 FSW or when the dive involves in-water decompression time of greater than 120 minutes, except when heavy gear is worn or when diving in physically confining spaces, or 1910.426 B1 2 A closed bell is used at depths greater than 300 FSW, except when diving is conducted in physically confining spaces. 1910.426 C. Procedures. 1910.426 C1 A separate dive team member shall tend each diver in the water. 1910.426 C2. A standby diver shall be available while a diver is in the water. 1910.426 C3. A diver shall be stationed at the underwater point of entry when diving is conducted in enclosed or physically confining spaces. 1910.426 C4. Each diving operation shall have a primary breathing gas supply sufficient to support divers for the duration of the planned dive, including decompression. 1910.426 C5. Each diving operation shall have a dive location reserve breathing gas supply. 1910.426 C6. When heavy gear is worn. 1910.426 C6. An extra breathing gas hose capable of supplying breathing gas to the diver in the water shall be available to the standby diver. And 1910.426 C6. 2. An in-water stage shall be provided to divers in the water. 1910.426 C7. An in-water stage shall be provided for divers without access to a bell for dives deeper than 100 FSW or outside the no decompression limits. 1910.426 C8. When a closed bell is used, one dive team member in the bell shall be available and tend the diver in the water. 1910.426 C9. Except when heavy gear is worn or where physical space does not permit, a diver-carried reserve breathing gas supply shall be provided for each diver. 1910.426 C9. Diving deeper than 100 FSW or outside the no decompression limits. Or 1910.426 C9. 2. Prevented by the configuration of the dive area from directly ascending to the surface. 1910.427 Liveboating. 1910.427 A. General. Employers engaged in diving operations involving liveboating shall comply with the following requirements. 1910.427 B. Limits. Diving operations involving liveboating shall not be conducted. 1910.427 B1 through 1910.427 B5 with an in-water decompression time of greater than 120 minutes, using surface-supplied air at depths deeper than 190 FSW, except that dives with bottom times of 30 minutes or less may be conducted to depths of 220 FSW, using mixed gas at depths greater than 220 FSW, in rough seas which significantly impede diver mobility or work function, or in other than daylight hours. 1910.427 C. Procedures. 1910.427 C1 through 1910.427 C5. The propeller of the vessel shall be stopped before the diver enters or exits the water. A device shall be used which minimizes the possibility of entanglement of the diver's hose in the propeller of the vessel. Two-way voice communication between the designated person in charge and the person controlling the vessel shall be available while the diver is in the water. A standby diver shall be available while a diver is in the water. A diver-carried reserve breathing gas supply shall be carried by each diver engaged in liveboating operations. 1910.430 Equipment. 1910.430 A. General. 1910.430 A1. All employers shall comply with the following requirements, unless otherwise specified. 1910.430 A2. Each equipment modification, repair, test, calibration or maintenance service shall be recorded by means of a tagging or logging system, and include the date and nature of work performed, and the name or initials of the person performing the work. 1910.430 B. Air compressor system. 1910.430 B1. Compressors used to supply air to the diver shall be equipped with a volume tank with a check valve on the inlet side, a pressure gauge, a relief valve, and a drain valve. 1910.430 B2. Air compressor intakes shall be located away from areas containing exhaust or other contaminants. 1910.430 B3. Respirable air supplied to a diver shall not contain. 1910.430 B3 I through 1910.430 B3 4. A level of carbon monoxide CO greater than 20 p/m. A level of carbon dioxide CO2 greater than 1000 p/m. A level of oil mist greater than 5 mg per cubic meter, or a noxious or pronounced odor. 1910.430b-4, the output of air compressor systems shall be tested for air purity every 6 months by means of samples taken at the connection to the distribution system, except that non-oil lubricated compressors need not be tested for oil mist. 1910.430c, breathing gas supply hoses. 1910.430c1, breathing gas supply hoses shall 1910.430c1 through 1910.430c1-4 have a working pressure at least equal to the working pressure of the total breathing gas system, have a rated bursting pressure at least equal to 4 times the working pressure, be tested at least annually to 1.5 times their working pressure, and have their open ends taped, capped, or plugged when not in use. 1910.430c2, breathing gas supply hose connectors shall 1910.430c2I through 1910.430c2-3 be made of corrosion-resistant materials, have a working pressure at least equal to the working pressure of the hose to which they are attached, and be resistant to accidental disengagement. 1910.430c3, umbilicals shall 1910.430c3I through 1910.430c3-3 be marked in 10 feet increments to 100 feet beginning at the diver's end, and in 50 feet increments thereafter, be made of kink-resistant materials, and have a working pressure greater than the pressure equivalent to the maximum depth of the dive, relative to the supply source, plus 100 psi. 1910.430d, buoyancy control. 1910.430d1, helmets or masks connected directly to the dry suit or other buoyancy changing equipment shall be equipped with an exhaust valve. 1910.430d2, a dry suit or other buoyancy changing equipment not directly connected to the helmet or mask shall be equipped with an exhaust valve. 1910.430d3, when used for scuba diving, a buoyancy compensator shall have an inflation source separate from the breathing gas supply. 1910.430d4, an inflatable flotation device capable of maintaining the diver at the surface in a face-up position, having a manually activated inflation source independent of the breathing supply, an oral inflation device, and an exhaust valve shall be used for scuba diving. 1910.430e, compressed gas cylinders. Compressed gas cylinders shall 1910.430e1 be designed, constructed and maintained in accordance with the applicable provisions of 29 CFR 1910.101 and 1910.169 through 1910.171. 1910.430e2 be stored in a ventilated area and protected from excessive heat. 1910.430e3 be secured from falling, and 1910.430e4 have shut-off valves recessed into the cylinder or protected by a cap, except when in use or manifold, or when used for scuba diving. 1910.430f, decompression chambers. 1910.430f1, each decompression chamber manufactured after the effective date of this standard shall be built and maintained in accordance with the ASME code or equivalent. 1910.430f2, each decompression chamber manufactured prior to the effective date of this standard shall be maintained in conformity with the code requirements to which it was built, or equivalent. 1910.430f3, each decompression chamber shall be equipped with 1910.430f3I through 1910.430f3-4 means to maintain the atmosphere below a level of 25% oxygen by volume, mufflers on intake and exhaust lines, which shall be regularly inspected and maintained, suction guards on exhaust line openings, and a means for extinguishing fire, and shall be maintained to minimize sources of ignition and combustible material. 1910.430g, gauges and timekeeping devices. 1910.430g1, gauges indicating diver depth which can be read at the dive location shall be used for all dives except scuba. 1910.430g2, each depth gauge shall be deadweight tested or calibrated against a master reference gauge every 6 months, and when there is a discrepancy greater than 2% of full scale between any two equivalent gauges. 1910.430g3, a cylinder pressure gauge capable of being monitored by the diver during the dive shall be worn by each scuba diver. 1910.430 G4, a timekeeping device shall be available at each dive location. 1910.430 H, masks and helmets. 1910.430 H1, surface-supplied air and mixed gas masks and helmets shall have. 1910.430 H1 I through 1910.430 H1 2, a non-return valve at the attachment point between helmet or mask and hose which shall close readily and positively, and an exhaust valve. 1910.430 H2, surface-supplied air masks and helmets shall have a minimum ventilation rate capability of 4.5 ACM at any depth at which they are operated, or the capability of maintaining the diver's inspired carbon dioxide partial pressure below 0.02 ATA, when the diver is producing carbon dioxide at the rate of 1.6 standard liters per minute. 1910.430 I, oxygen safety. 1910.430 I1, equipment used with oxygen or mixtures containing over 40% by volume oxygen shall be designed for oxygen service. 1910.430 I2, components, except umbilicals, exposed to oxygen or mixtures containing over 40% by volume oxygen shall be cleaned of flammable materials before use. 1910.430 I3, oxygen systems over 125 sig and compressed air systems over 500 sig shall have slow opening shutoff valves. 1910.430 J, weights and harnesses. 1910.430 J1, except when heavy gear is worn, divers shall be equipped with a weight belt or assembly capable of quick release. 1910.430 J2, except when heavy gear is worn or in scuba diving, each diver shall wear a safety harness with. 1910.430 J2 I through 1910.430 J2 3, a positive buckling device, an attachment point for the umbilical to prevent strain on the mask or helmet, and a lifting point to distribute the pull force of the line over the diver's body. 1910.440 Recordkeeping. 1910.440 A, 1910.440 A1, reserved. 1910.440 A2, the employer shall record the occurrence of any diving-related injury or illness which requires any dive team member to be hospitalized for 24 hours or more, specifying the circumstances of the incident and the extent of any injuries or illnesses. 1910.440 B, availability of records. 1910.440 B1, upon the request of the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health, or the Director, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, Department of Health and Human Services of their designees, the employer shall make available for inspection and copying any record or document required by this standard. 1910.440 B2, records and documents required by this standard shall be provided upon request to employees, designated representatives, and the Assistant Secretary in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020 A-E and G-I. Safe Practices Manuals, Section 1910.420, Depth Time Profiles, Section 1910.422, Recordings of Dives, Section 1910.423, Decompression Procedure Assessment Evaluations, Section 1910.423, and Records of Hospitalizations, Section 1910.440, shall be provided in the same manner as employee exposure records or analyses using exposure or medical records. Equipment inspections and testing records which pertain to employees, Section 1910.430, shall also be provided upon request to employees and their designated representatives. 1910.440 B3, records and documents required by this standard shall be retained by the employer for the following period: 1910.440 B3 I through 1910.440 B3 7, reserved. Safe Practices Manual, Section 1910.420, current document only. Depth Time Profile, Section 1910.422, until completion of the recording of dive, or until completion of decompression procedure assessment where there has been an incident of decompression sickness. Recording of dive, Section 1910.423, 1 year, except 5 years where there has been an incident of decompression sickness. Decompression procedure assessment evaluations, Section 1910.423, 5 years. Equipment inspections and testing records, Section 1910.430, current entry or tag, or until equipment is withdrawn from service. Records of hospitalizations, Section 1910.440, 5 years. 1910.440(b)(4). The employer shall comply with any additional requirements set forth at 29 CFR 1910.1020, 1910.440(b)(5), reserved. 1910 Subpart T Appendix A. Examples of conditions which may restrict or limit exposure to hyperbaric conditions. Appendix A to Subpart T of Part 1910. Examples of conditions which may restrict or limit exposure to hyperbaric conditions. The following disorders may restrict or limit occupational exposure to hyperbaric conditions depending on severity, presence of residual effects, response to therapy, number of occurrences, diving mode, or degree and duration of isolation. History of seizure disorder other than early febrile convulsions. Malignancies, active, unless treated and without recurrence for 5 years. Chronic inability to equalize sinus and or middle ear pressure. Cystic or cavitary disease of the lungs. Impaired organ function caused by alcohol or drug use. Conditions requiring continuous medication for control, e.g., antihistamines, steroids, barbiturates, mood-altering drugs, or insulin. Meniere's disease. Hemoglobinopathies. Obstructive or restrictive lung disease. Vestibular end organ destruction. Pneumothorax. Cardiac abnormalities, e.g., pathological heart block, valvular disease, intraventricular conduction defects other than isolated right bundle branch block, angina pectoris, arrhythmia, coronary artery disease. Juxta-articular osteonecrosis. 1910 Subpart T Appendix B. Guidelines for scientific diving. Appendix B to Subpart T of Part 1910 Guidelines for scientific diving. This appendix contains guidelines that will be used in conjunction with Section 1910.401, A2, 4, to determine those scientific diving programs which are exempt from the requirements for commercial diving. The guidelines are as follows. 1. The Diving Control Board consists of a majority of active scientific divers and has autonomous and absolute authority over the scientific diving program's operations. 2. The purpose of the project using scientific diving is the advancement of science. Therefore, information and data resulting from the project are non-proprietary. 3. The tasks of a scientific diver are those of an observer and data gatherer. Construction and troubleshooting tasks traditionally associated with commercial diving are not included within scientific diving. 4. Scientific divers, based on the nature of their activities, must use scientific expertise in studying the underwater environment and, therefore, are scientists or scientists in training. 1910 Subpart T Appendix C. Alternative conditions under 1910.401, A3, for recreational diving instructors and diving guides, mandatory. Appendix C to Subpart T of Part 1910. Alternative conditions under Section 1910.401, A3, for recreational diving instructors and diving guides, mandatory. Paragraph A3 of Section 1910.401 specifies that an employer of recreational diving instructors and diving guides, hereafter, divers or employees, who complies with all of the conditions of this appendix need not provide a decompression chamber for these divers as required under Sections 1910.423, B2, or C3, or 1910.426, B1. Equipment requirements for rebreathers. The employer must ensure that each employee operates the rebreather, i.e., semi-closed circuit and closed-circuit self-contained underwater breathing apparatuses, hereafter, SCUBAs, according to the rebreather manufacturer's instructions. The employer must ensure that each rebreather has a counterlung that supplies a sufficient volume of breathing gas to their divers to sustain the divers' respiration rates, and contains a baffle system and/or other moisture-separating system that keeps moisture from entering the scrubber. The employer must place a moisture trap in the breathing loop of the rebreather and ensure that the rebreather manufacturer approves both the moisture trap and its location in the breathing loop, and each employee uses the moisture trap according to the rebreather manufacturer's instructions. The employer must ensure that each rebreather has a continuously functioning moisture sensor and that the moisture sensor connects to a visual, e.g., digital, graphic, analog, or auditory, e.g., voice, pure tone, alarm that is readily detectable by the diver under the diving conditions in which the diver operates, and warns the diver of moisture in the breathing loop in sufficient time to terminate the dive and return safely to the surface. And each diver uses the moisture sensor according to the rebreather manufacturer's instructions. The employer must ensure that each rebreather contains a continuously functioning CO2 sensor in the breathing loop, and that the rebreather manufacturer approves the location of the CO2 sensor in the breathing loop. The CO2 sensor is integrated with an alarm that operates in a visual, e.g., digital, graphic, analog, or auditory, e.g., voice, pure tone, mode that is readily detectable by each diver under the diving conditions in which the diver operates. And the CO2 alarm remains continuously activated when the inhaled CO2 level reaches and exceeds 0.005 atmospheres absolute, ATA. Before each day's diving operations, and more often when necessary, the employer must calibrate the CO2 sensor according to the sensor manufacturer's instructions and ensure that the equipment and procedures used to perform this calibration are accurate to within 10% of a CO2 concentration of 0.005 ATA or less. The equipment and procedures maintain this accuracy as required by the sensor manufacturer's instructions, and the calibration of the CO2 sensor is accurate to within 10% of a CO2 concentration of 0.005 ATA or less. The employer must replace the CO2 sensor when it fails to meet the accuracy requirements specified in paragraph 1F3 of this appendix, and ensure that the replacement CO2 sensor meets the accuracy requirements specified in paragraph 1F3 of this appendix before placing the rebreather in operation. As an alternative to using a continuously functioning CO2 sensor, the employer may use a schedule for replacing CO2 sorbent material provided by the rebreather manufacturer. The employer may use such a schedule only when the rebreather manufacturer has developed it according to the canister testing protocol specified below in Condition 11, and must use the canister within the temperature range for which the manufacturer conducted its scrubber canister tests following that protocol. Variations above or below the range are acceptable only after the manufacturer adds the lower or higher temperature to the protocol. When using CO2 sorbent replacement schedules, the employer must ensure that each rebreather uses a manufactured, i.e., commercially pre-packed, disposable scrubber cartridge containing a CO2 sorbent material that is approved by the rebreather manufacturer, removes CO2 from the diver's exhaled gas, and maintains the CO2 level in the breathable gas, i.e., the gas that a diver inhales directly from the regulator, below a partial pressure of 0.01 ATA. As an alternative to manufactured, disposable scrubber cartridges, the employer may fill CO2 scrubber cartridges manually with CO2 sorbent material when the rebreather manufacturer permits manual filling of scrubber cartridges. The employer fills the scrubber cartridges according to the rebreather manufacturer's instructions. The employer replaces the CO2 sorbent material using a replacement schedule developed under paragraph 1H of this appendix, and the employer demonstrates that manual filling meets the requirements specified in paragraph 1I of this appendix. The employer must ensure that each rebreather has an information module that provides a visual, e.g., digital, graphic, analog, or auditory, e.g., voice, pure tone, display that effectively warns the diver of solenoid failure when the rebreather uses solenoids and other electrical weaknesses or failures, e.g., low battery voltage. For a semi-closed circuit rebreather, a visual display for the partial pressure of CO2, or deviations above and below a preset CO2 partial pressure of 0.005 ATA, and for a closed circuit rebreather, a visual display for partial pressures of O2 and CO2, or deviations above and below a preset CO2 partial pressure of 0.005 ATA and a preset O2 partial pressure of 1.40 ATA or lower, gas temperature in the breathing loop, and water temperature. Before each day's diving operations, and more often when necessary, the employer must ensure that the electrical power supply and electrical and electronic circuits in each rebreather are operating as required by the rebreather manufacturer's instructions. Special requirements for closed-circuit rebreathers. The employer must ensure that each closed-circuit rebreather uses supply pressure sensors for the O2 and diluent, i.e., air or nitrogen, gases and continuously functioning sensors for detecting temperature in the inhalation side of the gas loop and the ambient water. The employer must ensure that at least two O2 sensors are located in the inhalation side of the breathing loop, and the O2 sensors are functioning continuously, temperature compensated, and approved by the rebreather manufacturer. Before each day's diving operations, and more often when necessary, the employer must calibrate O2 sensors as required by the sensor manufacturer's instructions. In doing so, the employer must ensure that the equipment and procedures used to perform the calibration are accurate to within 1% of the O2 fraction by volume. Maintain this accuracy as required by the manufacturer of the calibration equipment. Ensure that the sensors are accurate to within 1% of the O2 fraction by volume. Replace O2 sensors when they fail to meet the accuracy requirements specified in paragraph 2(c)(3) of this appendix, and ensure that the replacement O2 sensors meet the accuracy requirements specified in paragraph 2(c)(3) of this appendix before placing a rebreather in operation. The employer must ensure that each closed-circuit rebreather has a gas controller package with electrically operated solenoid O2 supply valves, a pressure-activated regulator with a second-stage diluent gas addition valve, a manually operated gas supply bypass valve to add O2 or diluent gas to the breathing loop, and separate O2 and diluent gas cylinders to supply the breathing gas mixture. O2 concentration in the breathing gas. The employer must ensure that the fraction of O2 in the nitrox breathing gas mixture is greater than the fraction of O2 in compressed air, i.e., exceeds 22% by volume. For open-circuit SCUBA, never exceeds a maximum fraction of breathable O2 of 40% by volume or a maximum O2 partial pressure of 1.40 ATA, whichever exposes divers to less O2. And for a rebreather, never exceeds a maximum O2 partial pressure of 1.40 ATA. Regulating O2 exposures and diving depth. Regarding O2 exposure, the employer must ensure that the exposure of each diver to partial pressures of O2 between 0.60 and 1.40 ATA does not exceed the 24-hour single exposure time limit specified either by the 2001 National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Diving Manual, the 2001 NOAA Diving Manual, or by the report entitled Enriched Air Operations and Resource Guide published in 1995 by the Professional Association of Diving Instructors, known commonly as the 1995 DSAT Oxygen Exposure Table, and determine a diver's O2 exposure duration using the diver's maximum O2 exposure, partial pressure of O2, during the dive and the total dive time, i.e., from the time the diver leaves the surface until the diver returns to the surface. Regardless of the diving equipment used, the employer must ensure that no diver exceeds a depth of 130 feet of seawater, FSW, or a maximum O2 partial pressure of 1.40 ATA, whichever exposes the diver to less O2. Use of no decompression limits. For diving conducted while using nitrox breathing gas mixtures, the employer must ensure that each diver remains within the no decompression limits specified for single and repetitive air diving and published in the 2001 NOAA Diving Manual or the report entitled Development and Validation of No-Stop Decompression Procedures for Recreational Diving, the DSAT Recreational Dive Planner, published in 1994 by Hamilton Research Limited. Known commonly as the 1994 DSAT No Decompression Tables. An employer may permit a diver to use a dive decompression computer designed to regulate decompression when the dive decompression computer uses the no decompression limits specified in paragraph 5(a) of this appendix, and provides output that reliably represents those limits. Mixing and analyzing the breathing gas. The employer must ensure that properly trained personnel mix nitrox breathing gases, and that nitrogen is the only inert gas used in the breathing gas mixture, and when mixing nitrox breathing gases, they mix the appropriate breathing gas before delivering the mixture to the breathing gas cylinders, using the continuous flow or partial pressure mixing techniques specified in the 2001 NOAA Diving Manual, or using a filter membrane system. Before the start of each day's diving operations, the employer must determine the O2 fraction of the breathing gas mixture using an O2 analyzer. In doing so, the employer must ensure that the O2 analyzer is accurate to within 1% of the O2 fraction by volume. Maintain this accuracy as required by the manufacturer of the analyzer. When the breathing gas is a commercially supplied nitrox breathing gas mixture, the employer must ensure that the O2 meets the medical USP specifications, Type 1, Quality Verification Level A, or aviators breathing oxygen specifications, Type 1, Quality Verification Level E, of CGAG 4.3-2000, Commodity Specification for Oxygen. In addition, the commercial supplier must determine the O2 fraction in the breathing gas mixture using an analytic method that is accurate to within 1% of the O2 fraction by volume. Make this determination when the mixture is in the charge tank and after disconnecting the charge tank from the charging apparatus. Include documentation of the O2 analysis procedures and the O2 fraction when delivering the charge tanks to the employer. Before producing nitrox breathing gas mixtures using a compressor in which the gas pressure in any system component exceeds 125 pounds per square inch, SI, the compressor manufacturer must provide the employer with documentation that the compressor is suitable for mixing high-pressure air with the highest O2 fraction used in the nitrox breathing gas mixture when operated according to the manufacturer's operating and maintenance specifications. Employer must comply with paragraph 6(e) of this appendix unless the compressor is rated for O2 service and is oil-less or oil-free. And employer must ensure that the compressor meets the requirements specified in paragraphs I-1 and I-2 of section 1910.430 whenever the highest O2 fraction used in the mixing process exceeds 40%. Before producing nitrox breathing gas mixtures using an oil-lubricated compressor to mix high-pressure air with O2, and regardless of the gas pressure in any system component, the employer must use only uncontaminated air, i.e., air containing no hydrocarbon particulates, for the nitrox breathing gas mixture. Compressor manufacturer must provide the employer with documentation that the compressor is suitable for mixing the high-pressure air with the highest O2 fraction used in the nitrox breathing gas mixture when operated according to the manufacturer's operating and maintenance specifications. Employer must filter the high-pressure air to produce O2-compatible air. The filter system manufacturer must provide the employer with documentation that the filter system used for this purpose is suitable for producing O2-compatible air when operated according to the manufacturer's operating and maintenance specifications. And employer must continuously monitor the air downstream from the filter for hydrocarbon contamination. The employer must ensure that diving equipment using nitrox breathing gas mixtures or pure O2 under high pressure, i.e., exceeding 125 psi, conforms to the O2 service requirements specified in paragraphs I-1 and I-2 of section 1910.430. Emergency egress. Regardless of the type of diving equipment used by a diver, i.e., open-circuit scuba or rebreathers, the employer must ensure that the equipment contains, or incorporates, an open-circuit emergency egress system, a bailout system, in which the second stage of the regulator connects to a separate supply of emergency breathing gas, and the emergency breathing gas consists of air or the same nitrox breathing gas mixture used during the dive. As an alternative to the bailout system specified in paragraph 7(a) of this appendix, the employer may use, for open-circuit scuba, an emergency egress system as specified in section 1910.424 C4, or for a semi-closed circuit and closed-circuit rebreather, a system configured so that the second stage of the regulator connects to a reserve supply of emergency breathing gas. The employer must obtain from the rebreather manufacturer sufficient information to ensure that the bailout system performs reliably and has sufficient capacity to enable the diver to terminate the dive and return safely to the surface. Treating diving-related medical emergencies. Before each day's diving operations, the employer must verify that a hospital, qualified healthcare professionals, and the nearest Coast Guard Coordination Center, or an equivalent rescue service operated by a state, county, or municipal agency, are available to treat diving-related medical emergencies. Ensure that each dive site has a means to alert these treatment resources in a timely manner when a diving-related medical emergency occurs. And ensure that transportation to a suitable decompression chamber is readily available when no decompression chamber is at the dive site, and that this transportation can deliver the injured diver to the decompression chamber within 4 hours travel time from the dive site. The employer must ensure that portable O2 equipment is available at the dive site to treat injured divers. In doing so, the employer must ensure that the equipment delivers medical-grade O2 that meets the requirements for medical USP oxygen, Type 1, Quality Verification Level A, of CGAG 4.3-2000, Commodity Specification for Oxygen. The equipment delivers this O2 to a transparent mask that covers the injured diver's nose and mouth, and sufficient O2 is available for administration to the injured diver from the time the employer recognizes the symptoms of a diving-related medical emergency until the injured diver reaches a decompression chamber for treatment. Before each day's diving operations, the employer must ensure that at least 2 attendants, either employees or non-employees, qualified in first aid and administering O2 treatment, are available at the dive site to treat diving-related medical emergencies. and verify their qualifications for this task. Diving logs and no decompression tables. Before starting each day's diving operations, the employer must designate an employee or a non-employee to make entries in a diving log, and verify that this designee understands the diving and medical terminology and proper procedures for making correct entries in the diving log. The employer must ensure that the diving log conforms to the requirements specified by paragraph D, Record of Dive, of Section 1910.423, and maintain a record of the dive according to Section 1910.440, Recordkeeping requirements. The employer must ensure that a hard copy of the no decompression tables used for the dives, as specified in paragraph 6A of this appendix, is readily available at the dive site, whether or not the divers use dive decompression computers. Diver training. The employer must ensure that each diver receives training that enables the diver to perform work safely and effectively while using open-circuit SCUBAs or rebreathers supplied with nitrox breathing gas mixtures. Accordingly, each diver must be able to demonstrate the ability to perform critical tasks safely and effectively, including, but not limited to, recognizing the effects of breathing excessive CO2 and O2, taking appropriate action after detecting excessive levels of CO2 and O2, and properly evaluating, operating, and maintaining their diving equipment under the diving conditions they encounter. Testing protocol for determining the CO2 limits of rebreather canisters. The employer must ensure that the rebreather manufacturer has used the following procedures for determining that the CO2 sorbent material meets the specifications of the sorbent materials manufacturer. The North Atlantic Treating Organization CO2 Absorbent Activity Test, the ROTAP Shaker and Nested Sieves Test, the Navy Experimental Diving Unit (NEDU) Derived Schlegel Test, and the NEDO MeshFit software. The employer must ensure that the rebreather manufacturer has applied the following canister testing materials, methods, procedures, and statistical analyses. Use of a nitrox breathing gas mixture that has an O2 fraction maintained at 0.28, equivalent to 1.488 of O2 at 130 FSW, the maximum O2 concentration permitted at this depth, while operating the rebreather at a maximum depth of 130 FSW. Use of a breathing machine to continuously ventilate the rebreather with breathing gas that is at 100% humidity and warmed to a temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit 37 degrees Celsius in the heating humidification chamber. Measurement of the O2 concentration of the inhalation breathing gas delivered to the mouthpiece. Testing of the canisters using the 3 ventilation rates listed in Table I below, with the required breathing machine tidal volumes and frequencies, and CO2 injection rates, provided for each ventilation rate. See Table I. Canister testing parameters. When using a work rate, i.e., breathing machine tidal volume and frequency, other than the work rates listed in the table above, addition of the appropriate combinations of ventilation rates and CO2 injection rates, performance of the CO2 injection at a constant, steady, and continuous rate during each testing trial, determination of canister duration using a minimum of 4 water temperatures, including 40, 50, 70, and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.4, 10.0, 21.1, and 32.2 degrees Celsius, respectively, monitoring of the breathing gas temperature at the rebreather mouthpiece, at the Chrome T connector, and ensuring that this temperature conforms to the temperature of a diver's exhaled breath at the water temperature and ventilation rate used during the testing trial. Implementation of at least 8 testing trials for each combination of temperature and ventilation CO2 injection rates, for example, 8 testing trials at 40 degrees Fahrenheit using a ventilation rate of 22.5 lpm at a CO2 injection rate of 0.90 lpm, allowing the water temperature to vary no more than plus or minus 2.0 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 1.0 degrees C, between each of the 8 testing trials, and no more than plus or minus 1.0 degree F, plus or minus 0.5 degrees C, within each testing trial. Use of the average temperature for each set of 8 testing trials in the statistical analysis of the testing trial results, with the testing trial results being the time taken for the inhaled breathing gas to reach 0.005 ATA of CO2, i.e., the canister duration results. Analysis of the canister duration results using the repeated measure statistics described in NEDU Report 2-99. Specification of the replacement schedule for the CO2 sorbent materials in terms of the lower prediction line, or limit, of the 95% confidence interval, and derivation of replacement schedules only by interpolating among but not by extrapolating beyond the depth, water temperatures, and exercise levels used during canister testing.